want to welcome President Falk and our faculty and students, members of our community, and also a very special welcome to the Williams College Museum of Art Visiting Committee. Students, if you don't know who the Visiting Committee is, let me just explain, because it's something you should be aspiring to. If you study really hard and go on to do great things in the art world or serve the arts in your communities, you have an opportunity to be invited to be a volunteer and work with WICMA. Now, this is not a board, it's an advisory committee, but what it means is you become part of a brain trust that can help direct the future of the museum and also continue to support the teaching and learning with art that we do so well, and that made you want to come to Williams. So we're really thrilled to have our visiting committee here. They come from all over the country, and they add tremendously to the vitality of the museum and what we're able to provide all of you. This is the second lecture in the Fulkerson Program for Leadership in the Arts. It was started by Alan and Judy Fulkerson, who are here with us this evening. Welcome, Alan and Judy. They know that I say all the time that without their vision, this simply wouldn't have been possible. Alan is a member of the class of '54 and really understands the museum's teaching mission. He also served as the chairman of Mass MoCA's board, served as a college trustee, and he really understands what it means to be a teaching museum and wanted to find a way for you students to have contact in small settings with the great alumni in the arts that have such an important part of the Williams legacy. So I'd just like to take a moment to have a round of applause for Alan and Judy as a thank you. We also welcome our honored guest, Roger Mandle, and his wife, Gail, who herself is an artist and a curator. Rogers will be introduced by Professor Holly Edwards. But one thing I just want to say about him is that there is no part of the art world that he hasn't been touched by his brilliance, whether it's been as a museum director, as an educator, as a curator, as a scholar of Dutch art, or indeed now really being an incredible representative of this country abroad, where he is serving in the cultural community in the Gulf states. And I think what he has to say tonight will be incredibly timely, given how much that part of the world is currently in the news. We want to thank you, Roger, for making such a long journey, and thank you, Gail, also. Those of you who may not be aware, Holly Edwards and Magnus Bjørnardsson have for the past few years been working with the Williams College Museum of Art on a really remarkable exhibition that we expect to take place in the next few years. And Roger and Gail have been very gracious in sharing their knowledge, and tomorrow we'll do the same with our students. And so we're just really grateful to you for supporting our faculty research and really, returning to Williams not only as alumni, but also as a great friend of our faculty and students. I want to say just couple of things about Holly Edwards for those you students who haven't had a chance to study with her. She is not only a remarkable scholar in Islamic art, but she also is a terrific curator in her own right. She's not only curated exhibitions at the Williams College Museum of Art, such as Beautiful Suffering, Photography and the Traffic in Pain, Transgressions, Lala Asadi Confronts Jean-Léon Jerome, Forbidden Image, Persian and Mughal painting in the Williams College Museum of Art, but also at the Asia Society through Afghan Eyes, A Culture in Conflict, and at the Clark, one of my personal favorites, Noble Dreams, Wicked Pleasures, American Orientalism, 1870 to 1930. But more recently, she lent her expertise as an Islamicist to the museum's curatorial and education staffs, being one of the key voices in the reinstallation of the collection. Not only did she assist us with the part of the exhibition that is devoted to the display of 2 Qurans, but also participated actively in critical discussions about the nature of museum display. So I want to say that she's not only a scholar of Islamic art, but she's really one of us. And we like to think of her as really a member of the WICMA staff. So without further ado, Professor Holly Edwards, who will introduce Roger Mandle.
Thank you, Lisa. That was very kind, and thank you all for coming. It's a real honor for me to introduce our speaker tonight, joining us under the auspices of the Fulkerson Fund. I had a lovely dinner with Judy Fulkerson a few minutes ago, And I think that our speaker could not be better cast. Oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, his career began right here in the art department at Williams College, and then he went on to earn a master's degree and a certificate of museum practice from NYU and a PhD from Case Western Reserve. Those degrees qualify him as a specialist in Dutch art and aesthetics, but his professional trajectory has long since taken him beyond a particular field of academic expertise into the upper reaches of national and international arts administration. He acted as the director of the Toledo Museum of Art from 1977 to 88, the deputy director and chief curator of the National Gallery of Art from 1988 to 1993, and president of Rhode Island School of Design from 1993 to 2008. Along the way, he served on innumerable boards and commissions and was appointed by 2 presidents, Reagan and Bush, to serve on the National Council on the Arts. Clearly, the list goes on, and if I listed it all, we'd never get to him. Obviously, it takes considerable wherewithal to participate in such exalted circles and to lead such venerable institutions. But now I think you need to imagine, if you can, what it would be like to envision wholly new institutions rather than manage long-established ones. Such is our speaker's mandate as of 2008, when he was appointed by the Emir of Qatar to the directorship of the Qatar Museum Authority in Doha. 50 years ago, that capital city was a relatively small trading town, and now it's a metropolis of about 1 million people, the hub of Al Jazeera, and the proud sponsor of 2012 World Cup. Most importantly, it's the center of an audacious effort to use art as the fulcrum of a post-9/11 globalism, a cultural campaign in which modernization and Islam go hand in hand. The Qatar Museum Authority stands at the very center of this campaign, and its official mission statement would make a lesser job candidate quail. To unite and focus the efforts of all museums in the state of Qatar, to propose laws relating to historic preservation, to establish museums, and last but clearly not least, to present the state of Qatar. Our speaker is thus charged with helping to implement a transformative vision for an entire country and beyond, and that vision is materializing at light speed. Already, there is a newly opened Museum of Islamic Art housed in an iconic building designed by I.M. Pei and intended to be the foremost museum of Islamic art in the world. This past December, another museum dedicated to modern Arab art, Mataf, opened to considerable fanfare. The plans for a third museum, this one showcasing, of all things, Orientalism, are well underway, while a fourth, the National Museum of Qatar, is already under construction. Needless to say, the challenges are myriad. For a country just a few times the size of Rhode Island, in a broader region, awash with oil, but rife with revolution, who and where exactly are the museum audiences, and how can they be engaged effectively? More vexed still, what power can art wield when citizenship, wealth, religious conviction, and political legitimacy are heavily contested from all sides? Clearly, our speaker relishes a challenge, and he's here to share his experience with us. Please join me in welcoming Roger Mandle to the podium.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you all very much for coming, and a special thanks to the Fulkersons for making this podium possible, and for the special invitation to come back to what I consider to be my intellectual home. I think in many ways it's because of Williams College that I find myself in Qatar. And that is because the values that I learned in this extraordinary place have given me a sense that we have to give back more than we receive, that we also have to make the world a better place, and to also have a chance to build bridges among peoples wherever that's possible. And so, after a substantial time in the arts, I now find myself literally trying to build a Smithsonian from the sand up in this very small country. It's a country that has enormous resources, enormous ambitions, and a very clear-eyed vision of exactly what it should do in order to play on a world stage, but to bring its values and its understandings of the world to a broader audience, and to learn from it as well. It's a place of great cultural interchange, of deeply held values. And it's a place where Gail and I have learned an immense amount about ourselves that we would never know if we had not had a chance to be there for this 3 years plus. And so tonight I'm going to talk not just about Qatar, but I'm going to try to place what we're doing in Qatar in some kind of a context with the other museum developments that are happening in the Gulf. Because in some ways they symbolize the aspirations of these small states that have suddenly been placed on the forefront of the world stage by the resources that they found under their feet and in the water around them. And it's not by chance that each of them has their own way of thinking about what they can offer their people and in turn what they can offer and benefit from the world. But as you all know, museums as public institutions, particularly those supported by governments, are a relatively new phenomenon. That's my title. Other than the extraordinary ancient library in Alexandria, which this should be an interior shot of, and here is a view of its current image, its extraordinary building in which the world's knowledge is housed. Other than this extraordinary library in Alexandria, there were few places solely organized and supported to exhibit objects for the public. While there were public buildings, such as churches, temples, mosques, and other places that incorporated objects demonstrating the rich adornments of power, few of these institutions were dedicated to the public enjoyment of these objects. The first truly public museums were begun around Europe during the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, although museums of royal collections had been open to the public earlier, and there were also eccentrics who often opened up their country houses or their displays in the cities to make people aware of the great treasures they held. Some of the first public museums were the products of democratic or at least populist sympathies. By opening royal households to their citizens, governments made accessible, beautiful, and curious objects that were previously only available to rulers, and declared them to be available for public enjoyment. As symbols, museums demonstrated pride in the cultural attributes that expressed a nation's values, even if the objects reflected rulers' excesses at the expense of public well-being. These museums joined academies like the Ashmolean at Oxford, whose exhibitions over the centuries of art and science by members and students helped to educate the public about the arts and humanities. And of course, museums of art and other subjects were not the only places the public could enjoy great objects or great aesthetic experiences. Great architecture and art graced public spaces that were regarded as the measures of the ambitions of towns and cities and nations that commissioned them. Along with the patronage of music and literature and other aesthetic expressions, scientific research, historical writing, and the humanities were funded as a means of supporting the development of a great nation. Universities multiplied, where education in these disciplines would awaken a nation to its true potential and to prepare its future leaders to make their ultimate contributions to its success. Now, in the first decades of the 21st century, a similar cultural revolution is taking place in the Gulf, driven by extraordinary resources, by fertile imaginations, and by a genuine desire of the leadership of many of these small states to create a period of new cultural enlightenment for their citizens. Having lived and worked in Qatar for 3 years, I can attest to the sincerity and sophistication of that effort in that place. The energy and the ideas released through the money available is only part of that story. The royal family, led by His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar, has inspired a healthy outlook on the use of these financial gains at a time when the rest of the world is overspending its own capacity. Qatar's national goals are clearly articulated in a plan extending to 2030. which is actually past 2022, and the World Cup is supposed to be played in Qatar, and which is the deadline everybody seems to be focusing on. But there is this 2030 plan, of which the pillars are educational, economic, social, and environmental. Those 4 pillars are the underpinning of this long-term vision. What has been sponsored, created, built, established, enhanced, and articulated in this short half-century since oil and gas were discovered and these small Gulf nations were released from colonialism is nothing short of remarkable. Whole cities have been erected in less than a decade. In Qatar, in 5 years, the downtown, the West Bay of Qatar, has exploded with over 60 high-rise buildings. Previously, there had been 1 hotel there. Now, as you'll see in some slides I show you later, an entire city has been created overnight. Highly sophisticated social, economic, medical, and cultural infrastructures are being created and established where there were only small backward villages. Only 50 years ago, as Holly said, people in Qatar were living in the desert or along the sea and scratching out a life. I had an amazing conversation with the daughter of the emir who said to me once that her grandfather, the previous emir, had wondered at times when his next meal would come. That's how poor they were as a nation. And now they have the 2nd highest GDP income in the world. As the rest of the world depends for economic growth and maintaining its carbon-based lifestyles, the Gulf states with these natural resources are potentially everyone's best friend. Energy resources have fueled the per capita income of these small countries. Qatar's population has swelled from less than 500,000 a decade ago to over 1.6 million today. When we moved to Qatar in 2008, it was at 1.2, so you can see the enormous dramatic rise. And yet the per capita income continues to lead the world, even as natural gas resources in Qatar are just beginning to be deployed. Only in the last year and a half was the gas shipping port developed so that LNG can be shipped out of Qatar elsewhere. The next snapping rapidity by which the economic growth has occurred has caused strains in all aspects of Gulf society. Maintaining traditional values, religious and social customs, environmental controls, and family relationships are difficult when so much is available and so much seems possible to own. This is a view of the Lajo Mall in Qatar, which is a small Venice with gondolas that are powered that go back and forth and take Qataris on a tour from one shop to another. Shopping malls were the first things that developed in their country in which they could express to each other their economic gain. The strong Bedouin traditions that were brought from the desert to these new tall cities are being threatened. Muslim values are being pressed up against Western and Far Eastern traditions as expatriates are being imported to the Gulf for their experience and their capabilities, from architects designing these buildings and infrastructure to the laborers who are constructing it brick by brick in the hot sun. This is the West Bay skyline, and this is actually a photograph that's earlier. Now you see all these cranes, the cranes are gone, and there are more buildings that are beginning to rise out of the earth to come up side by side with the ones you see in this picture. More than half the population of Qatar, including its locals, are under the age of 30. The pressure on this age group, coupled with the connectivity of youth through the internet, mobile phones, TV, film, and modern media, make cultural homogeneity virtually impossible. Qatar and other Gulf states have found themselves being impacted, potentially overwhelmed, in fact, by Western and Far Eastern cultural fashions, unavoidable as they are totally joined to the technologically advanced global economic markets. How each nation is reacting speaks volumes about its potential and its changing values. This is a view of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, a country which has found itself in deep economic trouble because it leapt to homogenizing its society and completely overbuilding and overstretching its capabilities. While in some parts of the Gulf, the intention is to fashion a society based on current models elsewhere, in Qatar, His Highness the Emir has stated that Qatar's goal is to modernize and not to westernize. By this he means that the process of development will enhance Qatar and Islamic traditions while creating platforms for dialogue with the rest of the world's people for the benefit of all. In His Highness's view, mutual and respect and admiration among all peoples should come from the sharing of ideas and perspectives on an equal level. To achieve that level, Qatar must offer itself as a bridge to create dialogue and frequent exchange. Thanks to His Highness's quiet initiatives, Qatar has become a respected regional arbiter of peaceful interchange, leading to negotiations between nations and tribes whose tense relationships have become flashpoints in the past couple of years. Remarkably, during the recent economic downturn, Qatar's more conservative economic policies have protected it from disastrous overextensions that have blunted the growth of many states in the region and elsewhere around the globe. In Qatar, virtually all of the current projects remain on target for completion. Qatar's central bank spent nearly $1.75 billion to strengthen Qatar's bank's equity exposure, ending any potential crisis in Doha. HSBC has ranked Qatar one of the top places for expats to work and to save money during the recent business crisis in the world. And that is to say 90%, by the way, of Qatar's total workforce is expatriate. Qatar has been rated the fastest growing economy in the world. Its growth in 2011 is to be over 20% of its GDP. Qatar has invested internationally to diversify its holdings, as many of you know, including a substantial stake in Porsche Volkswagen, Harrods, Chelsea Barracks. These are some of the more high visibility investments that they're making. And yet their chief goal is to convert their energy-based economy to a knowledge-based economy in the next 20 years. That is a stated goal and one that they're working very hard on now. The Qatar Foundation, the most prominent private agency for development in Qatar, chaired by Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser Al Misnad, the consort of His Highness the Emir, is dedicated to developing human capital in the state. The mission of the foundation is to help build a sustainable society where sharing and creation of knowledge will enhance the quality of life. The foundation acts as a vehicle to convert the country's current but temporary wealth derived from oil and gas industry into durable human capital with long-term sustainability. It states that it will prepare the people of Qatar and the region to meet the challenges of an ever-changing world and to make Qatar a leader in innovative education and research. And this is a view of Education City, 2 buildings. You see in front of you the building of Georgetown, and below it the building of the General Studies building for the various of the 7, now 8 universities that are occupying that campus. Many of the initiatives are directed at the youth of Qatar, such as Education City, enabling them to succeed as Arabs with strong local identities in the world at large, and to give them the cultural confidence to contribute as Qataris to a world that was relatively remote to their parents less than a half a century ago. While the Emirates and other states in the Gulf have long and complex cultural histories, they do not have the rich archaeological heritage of vast continental civilizations such as Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Greece, Egypt, etc. Nonetheless, Gulf people's heritage can be traced and is filled with significant but more tender legacies. Much of the Gulf's history and traditions exist only as intangible heritage. Few great objects, such as we might call them, have been made in the Gulf that relate to its artistic history. The Gulf states have been largely inhabited by Bedouins and sheep herders, seafarer and fishermen whose capabilities and interest in building major cultural monuments has been limited over the centuries by their own resources. Much of the cultural significance, therefore, is imbued in objects that were packed up and carried from place to place on ships or in tents. Oral traditions still carry histories, stories, myths, and beliefs that are being lost as older generations in the Gulf pass on. Yet there are important stories to be preserved for the same reason that great objects resonate with their histories and give presence to the past in other places. Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi has said, "Our grandfathers and ancestors have left a wealth of cultural heritage to be proud of. We shall conserve it and build it as it is the soul of this land and of future generations." In 2004, Abu Dhabi Tourism Authority began an ambitious plan to develop 27 square kilometers of Saadiyat Island, making it the centerpiece of cultural development in Abu Dhabi and in the UAE. Through a master plan developed by the Tourism Development and Investment Company, Abu Dhabi is investing over $27 billion in this island. The planned cultural district on this island was designed to offer museums, performing arts institutions, and other activities. There are also planned to be 29 hotels with 7,000 rooms, 3 marinas for over 1,000 boats, 8,000 private villas, and 38,000 apartments. The island is expected to attract 3 million tourists into Abu Dhabi by 2015. So you can see these developments are just rampant and very quick. Abu Dhabi's program for this district has had one distinctive feature: to create partnerships with established museums and performing arts organizations from other parts of the world. The guiding principles for the cultural district, the book about the project states, were to make it into a destination that would offer, through its architecture, collections, and programs, the greatest cultural experience anywhere in the world for residents and tourists alike. The master plan was developed by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum Foundation in New York and included several other major institutions. These are to be the Guggenheim, of course, French museums under the banner of the Louvre Museum, a maritime museum, and a performing arts center. Other museums and activities are now being contemplated for there as well. And you can see this island with the leading edge of it being this extraordinary building designed by Frank Gehry. With the advice of the Guggenheim Foundation, TDIC engaged Frank Gehry to design the Guggenheim Museum on Saadiyat Island. The TDIC stated that the requirement was to build a museum that people all over the world would come to. So you can see that there is this intention to bring people to Abu Dhabi. The massive 30,000 square meter, 400 million structure will house major loans from the Guggenheim Museum and purchases of modern and contemporary art from all around the world. The building, as Gehry describes it, will be, as he says, formed like a courtyard of center galleries. The next ring of galleries surrounding that core, then radiating out of the center to larger galleries. They would have a variety of shapes that would be less formally constructed, and a third ring of the plan would be even larger galleries built like raw industrial space with exposed lighting systems. This is a close-eyed view of the model that has been well displayed. It would be in these galleries that would be home for a new scale of contemporary art commissioned by artists from around the world. Art that would be perhaps made on site and would be of a scale that could not be achieved in the normally organized museums anywhere else. In the end, you could create a cluster of galleries, Gehry says, that would allow for a tremendous amount of flexibility in organizing shows with a great deal of variety. Gehry says that the museum's design was inspired by the vernacular architecture of the Gulf region. Additional statements by the TDIC about the Guggenheim indicate that the collections and exhibitions would focus on modern and contemporary art since the Second World War, an era that saw the demise of easel painting and the emergence of more ephemeral forms of performance, installation, video, and earth art. The museum's exhibition spaces, including the site itself, will embrace the range of these practices, abandoning the notion of the museum as an insular and self-contained institution. This new model is engaged with and responsible to the vagaries of contemporary culture anywhere. Obviously, the museum is designed for a dramatic impact on the island. And in fact, if you can think of the Guggenheim in New York or Bilbao, this building is multiples in size of that. So it would have a very substantial impact on the end of this island. The Abu Dhabi government also has contracted with the French Ministry of Culture and French museums under the flagship of the Louvre for extended loans from their collections and exhibition and program development, training and workforce development as well. The TDIC commissioned the noted French architect Jean Nouvel to design a significant complex of structures to house these collections and activities. The complex would put 24,000 square meters of space under a giant pierced dome at an estimated cost of over $140 million. And this is a view looking down at the dome that is a mesh that covers over a myriad of galleries that are basically floating islands, each of their own. It's a remarkable design. Born of Nouvel's inspiration to consider this museum a small city, a cluster of simple structures along a leisurely promenade, this micro-city requires a microclimate that tells visitors they have entered an entirely new world. Nouvel covered this micro-city with a large dome, a form common to all civilizations. Made of a web of differing patterns interlaced into the translucent ceiling, the dome lets in a diffuse, magical light that enters the space in the tradition of great Arabian architecture. Water, as you can see, also plays a crucial role. It reflects the entire building and thus acts as a psyche, as Nouvel calls it, and it creates, with a little help from the wind, a mild microclimate underneath this dome. Nouvel goes on, the landscaping is a microcosm of different landscapes of the region, from the oasis to the dune, from the pond to the archipelago, each layer exposing its own specific plants and enhancing the character of an island on an island. The whole territory is no nostalgic vision of remote worlds or lost paradises. Rather, it's meant to be a trigger, an invitation to question our own sense of time. The Louvre Abu Dhabi's ambition is to participate fully in making Abu Dhabi a new crossroads of world culture. The visitor's itinerary through the museum will be on the basis of establishing a dialogue between and among the civilizations in the arts. The itinerary will be organized on the basis of themes, offering broad and novel visions of artistic goals and issues centered around genres such as portrait and landscape, concepts of travel, or the visual expression of relationships between human beings and of the world. The artworks exhibited shall have been produced using the widest variety of techniques, from paintings and sculpture and art objects, graphic arts, video, and art installations. This is the summary of Nouvel's project. Another project is the Maritime Museum, designed by the Japanese architect Tadao Ando, inspired by the observation, he says, of Abu Dhabi's nature, landscape, and maritime traditions. The building is carved from a simple volume and is shaped by the force and fluidity of Abu Dhabi's wind, which is ever present. Ando describes it as a solitary form that stands like a gate over a vast water court, defining a space encounter between two important landscape elements of Abu Dhabi's culture, the land and the sea. With its reflective surface, the water court visually merges the sight and the sea and reinforces the maritime theme of the museum. Within the ship-like interior of the volume, ramps and floating decks guide the visitors fluidly through the exhibition space, creating a dynamic gallery experience. Dhows float over the voids of the interior space and help create an intense visual experience by relating objects to one another and to the museum architecture as a whole. Outside the museum, docks will display historic vessels, a working dhow yard, sailing displays, and a water court. Finally, on the central axis of Abu Dhabi's cultural district, a pedestrian corridor links the Sheikh Zayed National Museum, which I'll show you in a minute, with a performing arts center designed by Zaha Hadid. This emerges from a linear movement, gradually developing into a growing organism that sprouts a network of successive branches. The statement about it goes on, as it winds through the site, the architecture increases in complexity, building up the height and depth and achieving multiple summits in the bodies housing performance spaces, which spring from the structure like fruits on the vine and faced westward toward the water. The building is immense, reaching 62 meters in height. Under the same vision of linking Abu Dhabi's museum with the arts of the rest of the world, the Performing Arts Center is supposed to house events from various media from around the globe. The Sheikh Zayed National Museum will also be constructed in Abu Dhabi. This institution, like the others, will be designed by noted architects from outside the region. Additionally, its program will be developed in connection with the British Museum, who will provide its experts and logistical support for the program's creation. It will comprise 150,000 square meters, or 15,000 square meters, excuse me. I still can't get square meters and square feet. Anyway, 15,000 square meters, and will have 5 large galleries, each devoted to themes about heritage and history of the UAE. These galleries are listed as heritage, environment, progress, and unity through leadership and education. Norman Foster has designed this extraordinary building, and Foster calls it a national monument to values which will evoke an element of contemplation and knowledge absorption. All these institutions in Abu Dhabi speak to their vision of the arts as central to finding their culture. The arts shown on Saadiyat Island that will define their culture mostly come from other cultures, with the exception, of course, of the Sheikh Zayed Museum, reflecting that expatriates that have come to build their nation on behalf of UAE are equal partners in that growth. While this approach is certainly not unique historically, because the Louvre itself is a repository of collections acquired by France throughout history from all over the world, the attempt to augment Arab and Gulf culture from a global context sets it apart from the region's historic aspiration to build its own creative sensibilities and to augment its own heritage as a backdrop for understanding its place in the rest of the world. Their amoeba-like absorption of culture to be consumed by the local appetite for the attributes of success from other parts of the world shows the UAE as desiring to represent itself as a culture of cultures. Now, before the financial crisis hit the UAE, Dubai also attempted to partner via contract with the Berlin State Museums, the Bavarian State Collections in Munich, the Saxonian State Museum and Art Collections in Dresden to establish a presence in the recently launched Core Dubai Cultural Area. The German museums were announced to work alongside the Dubai Culture and Arts Authority to create exhibitions and conferences. This was a part of Dubai's Sheikh Mohammed's concept of a universal museums project leveraging the German partners' collections and staff for the benefit of Dubai and for the region. So you can see it's quite similar to other parts of the UAE. One way to describe this Gulf cultural phenomenon in economic terms is by comparing it to what some economists have defined as the Foreign Direct Investment Index, that compares the flow of capital from rich nations to poorer ones' companies toward taking a controlling interest in their operations. Now, at the conclusion of this lecture, there'll be a multiple choice exam that will be passed out, and you will not be permitted to leave until you achieve at least 60% or higher based on this chart. But anyway, what's interesting about this is that this FDI has been named as the primary mechanism of measuring the global economy in local terms, impacting most on the process of globalization and urbanization studies. In the Middle East, during the early days of oil and gas discovery, foreign investment in the Gulf was substantial as nations and companies attempted to access critical energy resources. Economists noted the volatility of such investment trends. Now richer Gulf nations are investing in nations that had previously invested heavily in them. The banking and industrial investments of Qatar, for example, and Britain, Germany, and other countries are their means for diversifying their capital use and long-term financial stability. At this point, however, as Gulf nations also begin to invest in education and culture, it might be possible to measure this activity as it relates to the influx of intellectual and cultural capital from other parts of the world. If one could measure this kind of flow of capital out of the country, or the flow of intellectual or artistic capital into it, one might call it the Foreign Direct Cultural Investment Index, or the FDCII, instead of the FDI. In the case of Abu Dhabi, which is a good model on which to test this notion, the FDCII would indicate a high degree of foreign cultural capital being absorbed by their own invitation into that state. One measure of this investment is the amount that Abu Dhabi has paid to the Guggenheim and to the Louvre for the rent of their collections and services to create these museums. One could also add that the fees paid for architects from out of the region and the salaries to expatriates like me, hired to lead these museums and train the local staff, should also be thrown into the mix. One could also measure the balance among the Abu Dhabi art fair dealers from Europe and in the US and dealers from the region and the artists whose work they represent. Exhibitions of art in Abu Dhabi have featured the work of Picasso, collections from the Guggenheim, and private collections of Western contemporary art, like that of Larry Gagosian. Finally, one could add up the prices paid for the acquisition of works of art from these cultures outside the region, along with the work of Arab artists, for which the Abu Dhabi Guggenheim has created a long list, and they're beginning apparently to collect. This equation would indicate that Abu Dhabi, for example, has invested considerably in showcasing foreign cultures as a large part of its expansive cultural program. I'll come back to this equation later to compare the FDCII of Abu Dhabi to other Gulf states' cultural developments. Now, Dubai is also expanding its contemporary art scene. and has more commercial art galleries than any other location in the Middle East. It's also the host to the annual Abu Dhabi Art Fair, of which these are some recent photographs. The fair continues to grow and has now become a major showcase for regional artists and dealers. It's also now providing a locus for discourse and debate about the developing art and cultural scene throughout the region. Dubai has a museum devoted to portraying the history of Arab life and culture through dioramas, reenactments, and artifacts, along with this contemporary art scene. Located in an old fort and in other buildings nearby, the museum is a local delight that provides a link to the past. In an effort to diversify its economy away from dependence on its diminishing oil reserves toward tourism, Dubai has engaged with the world-renowned Dutch architect Ben van Berkel to design a museum of modern art for their city. And you can see this is a quite visionary structure by comparison to Arab contemporary or even traditional design. Elsewhere in the region, the Sharjah Museums Authority has had among the earliest and largest commitment to developing museums. Sharjah is one of the smallest and least populated of the UAE members, yet it has more museums than most other states in the Gulf, 16 at last count. There is the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, the school, which you see here, the school museum, the flight museum, the archaeological museum, the art museum, and contemporary Arab art museum, National Maritime Museum. This is a view inside the Islamic Museum, the Natural History and Botanical Museum, the Science Museum, the Aquarium, the Calligraphy Museum, the Children's Discovery Center, and numerous historical museums. The focus of these small and localized institutions is declared to be the education of the citizens of Sharjah and the UAE. Now, Sharjah is a much more intimate and home-like community than Dubai, which has obviously changed its scope. And Sharjah also sponsors a contemporary art biennial that gathers entries from all over the Middle East and North Africa. The Sharjah Art Museum and its Contemporary Art Museum hosts an exhibition that has become the most important institutional venue for contemporary art in the region. Now, Oman is one of the most tourist-oriented states among the UAE. Perhaps many of you in this audience have been to Oman because it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Among all the Gulf states, it's blessed with the most natural beauty among its coastline and its rocky hills and mountains. Oman is noted for its hospitality, and the museums there provide locals and tourists with a great deal of information about the history and attributes of the place. The National Museum of Oman, which is seen here, is telling the story of the Al-Busaidi dynasty and has collections of silver and copper ornaments, textiles, examples of Omani boats and ships, etc. There's also a history museum and an oil and gas exhibition center, a planetarium, an armed forces museum, a children's museum, a sea aquarium, marine sciences, and fisheries center. So you can see that these Gulf states are not devoid of long-term interest in culture. But just recently, the Omani government announced their new cultural complex, a 400,000 square meter building to house their national archives, a national library, and the Omani National Theater. Designed by Architectural Studio, the complex will be covered by a light filtering canopy, somewhat like Nouvel's, as you can see. Now, Bahrain is building, or was hoping to build, a museum of contemporary art designed by Zaha Hadid that was to open in 2012. The schedule is now perhaps somewhat open to question, but it was stated that the museum would emerge from the narrow coastal land stripe along the Gulf of Bahrain, describing a gentle curve while gradually rising from a ground into a volume that is formed and bends slightly and reaches over the water. The museum building appears mystically floating above the coastal landscape, is described by Zaha Hadid, the architect of the structure. The museum program there is for exhibitions of permanent and temporary collections, performance space, auditorium, education facilities, studios for artists and residents, offices, a cafe, a restaurant and retail shop, all the sort of traditional attributes of a museum that, as we know it. It's a 10,000 square meter museum and is based on a hybrid concept coming from the study of requirements of both traveling exhibitions and special installations. The needs for spatial neutrality and specificity have been considered by Zaha Hadid, and she's been quoted as saying about this museum that its spatial concept works from the inside out. Now, please keep that concept in mind. In Saudi Arabia, there are a number of important museum developments, including the recently opened National Museum in Riyadh, designed by Moriyama and Tashina, Canadian architects. This museum, opened in 1999, was one of the first museums designed to contemporary international museum standards. It joins a reported 26 other museums already in Riyadh, and it's part of a large educational complex and park, and sets the theme for the exterior and interior environments as the whole by the way in which it integrates the local materials. Here's a view inside the museum, showing some of the traditional artifacts that are part of the collection. At the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, known as KAUST, being built near Jeddah, museums are being created parallel to the academic program of this university. Financial and logistical support is coming from Aramco, the state-run energy company. Inaugurated in 2009, this all-graduate research university is based on its role in Saudi Arabia to build a knowledge-based economy, just like Qatar, in the same manner that many of the other Gulf states are attempting as well. It's called a city university of universities, and the invitation to Abu Dhabi's university to create a full academic program is another similar attempt. In Qatar, we not only have Cornell, we also have Virginia Commonwealth University, we have Georgetown, we have Northwestern, we have Texas A&M, we have just recently added UCL's graduate program to the mix, and there's a French business school that's about to be announced that will join up as well. But the KAUST's endowment in Saudi Arabia of $10 billion places it among the richest universities in the world, far beyond many in this country as well. It has a new faculty growing at a rapid rate, and the hiring of research professionals being promised top salaries continues apace, and they are competing with just about every university in the world at this point in hiring good talent. In the midst of this growing university, the group of museums that are being built there will be dedicated to support the educational goals to create a culture of innovation. So you see there's this rush toward trying to create out of the soil a new Arab Renaissance that's trying to be developed. Qatar's museum program began in 1977 with the opening of the National Museum of Qatar, which incorporated and expanded early 20th century palaces of the Emir Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim Al Thani. This charming complex was revivified to animate the history of early Qatar, along with an aquarium and ship models, natural history collections, and other objects of significance. The museum was operated by the National Council on the Arts, Humanities, and Culture, which closed the museum, this is another view of it, in 2003 in preparation for a new campaign to bring Qatar's museum practice and facilities into the 21st century. By the time it was closed, it was a very tired facility, but it was beloved by the local community. The successor organization to that council, Qatar Museums Authority, which I manage, now has collections of the nation, which were acquired over the past 15 years by various members of the Al Thani family, led by His Highness the Emir. In 2006, as part of the Asian Games public programming in Doha, aspects of the nation's growing cultures were exhibited for the first time. From the show of treasures of Islamic art to extraordinarily rare dinosaurs and fossils, Arab textiles, Orientalist paintings, sculpture and decorative arts to photographs and modern Arab art, these exhibitions showed for the first time that Qatar had already assembled collections of exceptional scope and quality. From these collections has come the agenda for QMA. QMA, as it's called, is also managing the Archaeological Heritage and Preservation Program for the nation, and many important ancient objects from Paleolithic through Abbasid and Ottoman times have been excavated in Qatar and are now part of our collections. The first museum to open since the Asian Games in Qatar under QMA's auspices is the Museum of Islamic Art. Designed by the renowned Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei, the museum sits on its own island, projecting from a 62-hectare park back from the corniche that circles the bay around the center of Doha. The Museum of Islamic Art has a collection of masterpieces that spans 14 centuries and 3 continents, some 3,000 objects. The collection in all media is still growing. An exhibition was held last summer of more recent acquisitions. The museum reflects Islamic architecture's influence on the 94-year-old architect I.M. Pei. It is perhaps among his most important projects, and is surely the last best example of 20th century museum design. The MIA, as it's called in Doha, is a 350,000 square foot building of 5 floors and 2 major wings of galleries and education. Between these wings is a large fountain courtyard. In an education wing, there are research library, studios, and classrooms. In the floors that connect these wings, there are storages, conservation facilities, and offices. There will be a 5-star restaurant and a daily cafe, and a museum shop is on the main floor. There is a dome that rests 50 meters above the entry hall, which you see here. This is the entry hall looking down on it. And to the water side of the building, there's a 5-floor window that allows light to flood the atrium with spectacular views of Doha's West Bay. And this is a view up toward the top of the dome. The galleries have been designed by Pei with the assistance of the French interior designer Jean-Michel Wilmot. Clad in wood, stone, and glass, these galleries create a spectacular setting for the treasures that have been installed in them. Pei and Wilmot decided that each masterpiece should be exhibited alone so that its special qualities could be amplified in the intimate settings created for them. You can see that many of the objects in these very large cases are really quite small. If they were all arrayed on a single shelf, they'd be lost among each other. But here they've been given special attention so that they really become glowing specimens to ignite the interest of the public in seeing them. Information labeling has been kept to a minimum in these galleries. Supplementing the labels is a computer-based aided touring device that can depict other examples, original sites, and much more information that could ever be placed on a label. And recorded tours are also available by these devices. And here's some other views of these galleries. I've described the Museum of Islamic Art as being the last great museum of the 20th century. What I mean is that, as with most museums up until that time, their program began with the object. In the case of the Museum of Islamic Art, its program begins with exceptional objects. From each of these objects is built a relationship with other objects in the room in order to tell a story. The entire museum is made up, then, of objects arranged to tell stories based on their relevance to each other. In other words, the museum begins with the collection and migrates to the perimeter of the museum's influence inside the building. To use Zaha Hadid's phrase to describe the concept for her contemporary art museum in Bahrain, which you see here again, the museum is designed from the inside out. What she apparently meant by that phrase is that the museum attends first to the needs of the works of art. While she undoubtedly does not take the museum's intended visitors for granted, her inside-out approach defines the museum by its focus on works of art. And in fact, most contemporary works of art were themselves made for showing in museums, a cozy collaborative relationship. This inside-out approach is as ancient as the first museums that came from princely collections where the objects were mainly commissioned or collected for specific purposes. This approach completely ignores the means available now for potential visitors to experience these objects outside the museum. Through the internet, through high-definition television, printed publications on mobile phones, and other handheld devices, more information is clearly displayed than one can possibly experience in galleries, unless one were to display works of art as books on a wall. Now, while I'm not suggesting that these other encounters with works of art owned by museums are a substitute for the encounter with an original object, they do intervene now in ways that traditional museums did not have to take into account until recently. An additional flaw in the inside-out approach to museum design is that with all the correlative verbal, visual, and written information so readily available to potential museum visitors, the museum's interior context for the visitor's encounter with the exhibitions is not fully relevant any longer, and the visitor knows it. An altarpiece from a Dutch church of the 15th century is not in its original place in a museum, nor is a mosque lamp hung in a gallery. In fact, the issue of context is the most significant one in the design of museums in the Gulf. The relationship of Qataris to their land and the sea has changed now dramatically. In just 2 generations, Qataris have left the desert for urban life. The desert has become an artifact of contemporary life in Qatar, visited from Doha in 4-wheel drive vehicles by residents on weekends in place of riding on camels. The romance of the desert remains for Qataris, even if the hardships of living there have been replaced with air-conditioned villas, automobiles, and high-rise office towers. Traditional dhows cruising on the Gulf can now be made of fiberglass, and instead of carrying pearl divers or fishermen, they carry weekend fishermen. Leaders of Qatar are concerned about maintaining a sense of identity and purpose in a society that has been overtaken by foreign workers brought to Qatar and by all the electronic means by which their citizens can learn about other parts of the world and the ease by which people with money can travel. While there have been major connections between the Gulf states and the rest of the world over the centuries, the intrusion of foreign workers and businesses, along with fast food restaurants, automobiles, movies, fashions, etc., threatens the very identity and customs of this small nation. These customs are tied closely with Islamic religion and are fondly and deeply held. Qataris' traditions and history have been transferred orally from one generation to the next lovingly by elders to their children. Quranic texts and stories that extend family tradition, culinary recipes from the past have all been recited over the ages to pass them on. The political consequences of breaking this chain of communication and of losing Qatar's connection with their religion and culture is deeply significant. Qatar is primarily a Sunni Islamic community. Its beliefs are based on a close reading of the Quran. The Islamic values imbued in the Qataris' culture require warm hospitality to their guests in this small place, yet the proportion of guest workers to the native population is now so overwhelming that the need to reinforce traditional values of Qatar is becoming far greater every single day. So, Qatar's next museum that we're developing at the Qatar Museums Authority is therefore the National Museum of Qatar. Its mission is to present the history, traditions, and natural environment, and even the geology of this country, to teach from and to preserve this knowledge. The museum's large collections depict these themes. They're mostly artifacts, but they're important, and so is the oral tradition. The process of designing this museum has departed from the traditional focus on the collection to begin with the attention to the potential visitors to the museum. QMA is reversing Haddad's concept of the museum design from the inside out. The National Museum of Qatar is being designed from the outside in. Rather than starting with the needs of the object, the National Museum of Qatar is starting its conception with the visitor's requirements to know and to learn. The museum is creating new contexts in which the collection responds to themes that have been developed, just like the ones in your own museum that you've just opened now with a new installation, which is, by the way, brilliant. It's a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. These themes that we've developed are based on research, not only in the general attributes of Qatar's history and culture, but also in the visitors' potential responses. Not just Qatari visitors, but how will visitors from outside the Gulf respond to what they're seeing? What do they need to learn about Qatar's culture to elevate it to a world discussion and interchange? So extensive interviews with Qataris and non-Qataris is being undertaken to understand their perspectives on Qatar's history and their receptivity to various approaches to exhibitions and programs. To make the link of the visitor with the overall message of the museum and to each object within it, large film environments that set the context for the visitor will be augmented by online handheld devices that give the visitor many more visual resources and information far beyond the galleries, and of course will allow them through apps to have it in their own home or wherever they happen to be. The architect for this National Museum is Nouvel. He's obviously no stranger to the Gulf. In Doha, Nouvel has also just completed a tall mixed-use building in the high-rise of West Bay. His team, working with the staff of the National Museum of Qatar, has created an exceptional architectural program. The site near the Museum of Islamic Art in the Corniche in Doha will be developed as a park planted with trees and gardens of Qatari origin. The building is 370,000 square feet, and its construction has begun, and the project will be completed in 2014. Nouvel's architectural theme for the museum, and you can see an aerial view here which embraces and incorporates the old palace that I showed you as the first National Museum site, was inspired by the desert rose, which is part of the geological tradition of the Qatari landscape. Rising from the soil on the Corniche as if it were being formed by the silica and gypsum and water by the wind, the museum will house vast and intimate galleries. There are few 90-degree angles in this building, and each gallery has its own scale and organic shape. This is a typical gallery which shows both artifacts, but also there will be large-scale films which are being created by artists being commissioned for these films that will also set the context, the geological or the landscape context or the water context for the experience of the objects. The interpretation and theory and practice have been developed by a team called Reperage from Paris, a remarkable group of museum designers with strong Arab ties. One of their most difficult projects is to define Qatar's modern history, and they must base their work largely on intangible evidence and by much consultation with the current rulers. They are establishing the accuracy in fact and tone through interviews of tribal and family elders with government leaders even more than with expatriate scholars whose observations may be tainted by their own natural heritage. The museum is also being conceived by Nouvel and NMQ teams as an emitting facility. That is, the museum is just one location in this tiny state for a Qatari or tourist to learn about the nation's geology or flora or fauna or its history. It's possible for visitors, since Qatar is about the size of Connecticut, to go from the National Museum out to the desert or go to the sea, to a sea aquarium or to an oil rig to experience firsthand what is introduced in the National Museum. Since the science and history of Qatar's background is being discovered in the process of creating the National Museum, a large library and research facility will be developed as a part of the program for it. Local universities, archives, and scholars are being deployed so that the museum can serve as a centerpiece for the nation's desire to know itself more completely and accurately. Collections are growing thanks to a national effort to discover important artifacts that can enhance the museum's ability. We're going to hold a kind of community treasure house event in which people are invited to bring their artifacts from their house to show them, sort of like Antique Roadshow to us, to help us identify them and help them know more about them, but also hopefully to capture objects that will be useful for our collections. Local food and recipes will be prepared in the museum's restaurants, and we're going to develop a culinary gallery where we're going to demonstrate Qatari and Gulf food. Performances of local musicians and dancers will take place in the Caravanserai in the center courtyard of the National Palace that's been incorporated in the design. And a film theater will augment the presentations and will allow chronicles of Qatari life by local and international filmmakers. Another museum has just opened in Qatar. This is Mataf, the Arab Museum of Modern and Contemporary Arab Art. This museum's collections in all modern media are substantial and demonstrates the roots and influences on artists from this region over the past 100 years or so. The museum features exhibitions of this collection, contemporary loan shows, commissions and performances that showcase the latest views on modern traditions and experiments in contemporary media. But it is really dedicated to artists of our region. And the collection that was established about 25 or 30 years ago goes all the way back to the 1920s and 30s to feature artists who first discovered their artistic interests, went to Paris or to Germany or to the States to begin to look, to develop their own taste, and then came back and developed their own vocabulary. And the collection shows, as time moved forward, how the movements have begun to be incorporated in their own culture. This museum has been designed by Jean-François Baudin, a noted French museum interior designer, and also focuses on the relationship of the visitor to the art, making sure that the exhibitions anticipate visitors' questions in the experiences that are provided. The interpretive program is highly experiential and experimental, and it keeps changing all the time. It's linked to the web and other devices to engage visitors even before they arrive at the museum's door. That the overall approach of the museum is intentionally informal, to attract visitors and to make them feel comfortable, particularly Qatari, with these unfamiliar objects. Mataf's opening was coupled with the inauguration of another large exhibition facility near the Museum of Islamic Art that featured 2 shows commissioned by modern Arab masters and by younger contemporary artists. This is a 50,000 square meter exhibition hall with a 48-foot-high ceiling that allows us space for huge experimental exhibitions, sort of like Mass MoCA, and allows us to invite artists from all over the world, but also to develop exhibitions of Arab contemporary artists as well. As Mataf opened, we opened this exhibition with 2 large shows of contemporary Arab artists. Each artist had its own gallery. Qatar's vision for itself will manifest in the diversity of collections, museums, and cultural experiences planned over the next decade. This ambitious program has been approved by His Highness and is the vision of his daughter, my boss, Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Mayasa bint Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani. The staff of Qatar Museums Authority is committed to implementing this vision through a number of as yet unannounced institutions, perhaps as many as a dozen of them, in the 21st century. The notion of designing the museum from the outside in will continue to inspire our approach in Qatar, and each new museum, and there will be many, are an opportunity to test new ideas, materials, and staff. Since we don't have museums, we have the luxury of designing museums afresh for the 21st century, and also to build a community of artists and museum professionals from within the Qatari community. My job, in fact, is to work myself out of a job by training people to replace me from the local community. So Qatar is dedicated to the proposition that by creating world-class museums that serve local visitors well, their institutions will rank among the global firmament of the highest quality museums. From this position, it will be possible to maintain discourse and exchanges from other museums around the world. And in fact, in the Museum of Islamic Art now, we have an exhibition of 44 masterpieces from the Rijksmuseum, which shows some very interesting parallels between the 17th century in the Netherlands and the emerging nation of Qatar now. When you think about the fact that Qatar is very much like Spain, like the Netherlands having thrown off the yoke of Spain, Qatar having thrown off the British yoke, explosion of resources and trade, immense developments in artistic achievement, intellectual growth, etc. There are some very strong parallels, even to the very conservative society of each in their own time, that served as the background for this explosion of liberal imaginations. Additionally, we seek to create museums that serve as bridges of cultural understanding, promoting our own cultural qualities while exploring the relationships with other institutions. I'm really pleased I've had a chance to talk to you about all of this. Even as I speak of it now, I keep thinking of new ways in which these museums are going to serve our local public. By reaching out to education institutions like Williams and other universities, we hope to attract students who could become interns, faculty who could teach us and teach our students in Qatar, and to engage in exchange programs that realize His Highness the Emir's vision. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Would any of you have any questions? Yes? That's a very interesting question. When we opened the Museum of Islamic Art 2 years ago, people from the press would say, well, now how many visitors do you expect to come? We had no idea. There was no museum going public. There were no museums. So we had no idea. And over the past 2 years, we've had over 600,000 visitors. And to our statistical analysis, it shows that more than half of them are Arab and come from Qatar. The other half come from outside the Qatari region. But most of those people live in Qatar. Qatar is not yet, as Dubai or even Abu Dhabi, developed enough to be a real tourist attraction. So most of the visitors of that 600,000 come from Qatar. Now it's interesting, and we're doing some very serious studies of our audience in these institutions as we develop them. Mataf, the Modern and Contemporary Arab Art Museum, is not currently drawing a great local public. Most of the people who come are visitors who have read about it in press releases or in the art media. We certainly get school groups, but I think there is not a reluctance but an unfamiliarity with contemporary art in our region. And this is something that, of course, we're going to continue to work to create new audience to develop. So it's too early to tell overall. We're pretty sure that the National Museum of Qatar will attract an enormous local population. Already we're linking with schools so that there'll be mandatory school visits, etc. And it was, in its time when it was opened back in the 70s, the most popular cultural attraction. Well, it was the only cultural attraction in Qatar. But we're learning. It's too early to tell. I mean, we are not designing and opening these museums as events. We're designing and opening them for the millennium. And I have to say that one of the most fascinating things for me working in Qatar and helping me learn about the local Qatari situation is that there is no professional or legal or practical infrastructure for anything we are doing. And this is where we're vastly different from Abu Dhabi, which has literally purchased a franchise. We're building our own restaurant. We're not bringing McDonald's to the corner. And this is a very different experience. And it means that every contract, every arrangement with the customs officials at the airport to bring in an exhibition like the Rijksmuseum exhibition is a long and complicated negotiation. Oftentimes the first answer is no, and not just no, but absolutely no. And so we have to constantly keep explaining this and working with local officials. And I can tell you our meetings with the Ministry of Finance, when we go for our government mandated budget every year, are always very interesting. They're always a learning. Well, it reminds me of the National Gallery when I would go to Congress to ask for our appropriation for the National Gallery. You know, usually it was someone like Senator Byrd who would say, "What have you done for West Virginia?" And that would be the question we'd be asked. It wouldn't be about what are the goals of the gallery for the, and it's the same with the Ministry of Finance. It's really an entire communicative learning process. We learn about their concerns and their questions, and we help them learn about what we're trying to do. It's fascinating work. It is, it's really marvelous to have this experience because it tests everything I think I know. And I also find out how little I really know, and I'm doing a lot of consulting with my friends in the museum field to help me. Other questions? Yes. Well, I think that even though they are designed by Western architects, the Museum of Islamic Art and the National Museum in Qatar are both in a vocabulary that speaks, we hope, strongly to the local landscape and the local cultural traditions. That was an absolute priority. There was actually a competition for the Museum of Islamic Art, and there were many architects who presented buildings, and they were all rejected because none of them spoke as eloquently as I.M. Pays did later on. And Mr. Pei did an enormous amount of research, even at the age of 91, going from Istanbul all the way to Cordoba to look at buildings, and he finally chose the Mosque of Ibn Tulum in Cairo as his model for the building that finally he designed. So it's a balance. And because Qatar now sees itself, as all these nations do, in the middle of the world, on the one hand there's no escape, and on the other hand it is a deeply necessary way of moving forward. Other questions? Yes, sir. Well, that's a question my wife was asking before we went there. We live in a house in a compound. We live in a 3-bedroom house with a lovely courtyard in the middle, with a nice little garden with a tall palm tree, date palm that produces dates every summer, and a little garden, and bougainvillea and parrots that fly through the compound. There are Qataris who live there. There are people from Asia, from Australia, from the US, and so on. So it's a very international compound. There are other workers' compounds which are not so international. We live not very far from a shopping mall called Landmark, where the Gap, where Paul's, you can get a great loaf of bread, French bread at Paul's. You can get sunglasses at the Sunglass Hut. You know, the West is at their doorstep. One day my wife and I drove to Dukhan, to the other side of the country, to the oil producing area, because we wanted to drive through the desert and see that area. We got to the other side of the country, which takes about 45 minutes, and we were really hungry for lunch. And we were looking around for some kind of restaurant. You know what we found? The only thing that was open in Dukhan was McDonald's. And the McDonald's are serving something called Macarabia. So, you know, there's a fair attempt at adaptation by companies that are trying to place their mark in Qatar as well. But I can only tell you that the Qataris are immensely welcoming. They are very friendly, but they are also very private. The Qataris have their own culture they're trying to preserve, and they live traditionally inside walled houses or compounds themselves. And men and women's social lives are distinctly separate, except when families gather. Men are invited to the majlis, which is often a large room in a house or separated from the house where one can go for a late evening entertainment of sitting around and talking or watching a football game, as I did one evening in a house of a distinguished Qatari government officer, and or talking about world culture or the arts or just in general just getting together. I've been to the male component of a wedding. Men and women celebrate separately a wedding, very lavishly if they can afford it, and they're wonderful affairs with traditional sword dancing and chanting and singing and a very wonderful dinner of Arab food and so on. But it's a very large expat population, and so Qataris dress in a traditional thobe. The males wear thobes and a white covering called dishdash, and the women wear abayas. Some women wear abayas with a total face covering. Many of them just wear the face scarf, and some of them let it hang quite loosely. Many Qatari women and men, when they get on a plane to go to Paris or London or New York, will immediately take off their thobe or abaya and dress in Western clothes. So it's really about maintaining the culture very strongly there, not just for each other, but for their children. Yes, sir. Well, we are developing our education programs and our staff. We have docents that we have trained to take children's groups around. We have something like 15,000 to 20,000 school children who go through the Museum of Islamic Art every year. We have lectures, we have seminars, we have films, we have changing exhibitions. Many of the traditional kinds of education programs we undertake, but we also have a very strong studio tradition in the Museum of Islamic Art in which students learn traditional Arabic calligraphy and also do ceramic painting and study the patterns and the themes in the museum. So we have a very wide-ranging series of activities for children and adults. Yes? Well, the first thing they have to be is respected, not just by the people trying to preserve them, but by all people. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned is how the Emir and Sheikh Amoza are weaving into all of the educational experiments the importance of Arabic culture. It's not just for a religious purpose by any means. It's really to add grace, a grace note that reflects their part of the world. And they're very outspoken on a world stage, as you know, but they always do it from a context. They're not trying to be something they're not, which is so refreshing. But on the other hand, they are asking us to respect them in the same way. And I think one of the greatest problems we all face today is stereotyping. I've developed an idea for a children's exhibition called Muslim Worlds. The idea would be to show the cultures of each of the Muslim communities, major Muslim communities around the world, not from a religious perspective, but to show the variety of food and music and or lack of music or whatever it would be that would help us understand and celebrate the differences. Those people who are Muslim would see how richly diverse their cultures are. Those people who don't know anything about those religious cultures would learn something for the first time and could not make a stereotypical comment. Yes? Well, one of the things I think that would be very important is to try to recruit students from the region. They have been notoriously absent from our campuses. At RISD, where I was president for 15 years, we did not have many students from the region at all. There are few designers, Zaha Hadid being one of the most celebrated. There are other designers who are well known as well, but very few artists who are known. I think that Williams could do well to recruit from that region. They're enormously bright, articulate, and willing students from that area, and I think those connections would help build bridges. I think one of the major responsibilities of a liberal arts institution is to build those bridges through its personal contacts. Invite faculty from there to come and teach. There are brilliant faculty at Qatar University, for example, who could teach culture here and speak on behalf of their own. Also, We'd love to have interns. You know, it's possible to set up relationships with institutions in the region. The Guggenheim, I know, has internship programs, and they're developing programs in Abu Dhabi. Yes? Well, you know, the art newspaper, which is always prone to blowing things out of proportion, once called it to be a cultural arms race going on in the Gulf, among these Gulf states. I don't see it that way at all, and I hope one of the things I made the point about in my lecture was that there are very different approaches in each country, which is trying to carve out its own relationship to world culture and their own history. So I think if you were to scratch a little deeper, perhaps in some people's intentions, you might find a certain over-the-shoulder jealousy or a desire to best the neighboring state. But among the professionals and among the people who are serious about it, no, there isn't. In fact, I created an organization called Gulf Arts Leaders, and we have representatives from Kuwait and from Oman and Abu Dhabi and Sharjah and Saudi who come for an annual meeting, and we talk about how we can work together. And each Gulf state is supposed to talk about its own cultural development and what's the latest news. And then quietly there are discussions in which we really learn what's going on, and it's very helpful. Yes, in the back. Well, there's a grand intention, but just as the Metropolitan was created in the late 19th century with great aspirations, no one knew what the Metropolitan Museum was going to do. I was there just the other day, and Emily Raftery, the president of the museum, told me that they had, that very day, they had 76,000 visitors. You know, in 1888, did they know that that's what it was going to become? I'm sure they had the same kind of infrastructure problems we have right now, trying to figure out how to get loan forms created and how to develop a registrar's office that can relate to the customs officials as we bring things into the country. I don't know that there's a real answer to that. All I know is that this 2030 vision of Qatar is trying to maintain a sense of balance and relationship among these institutions for the betterment of that part of the world. But it's too early to tell. Yes? Well, the government of Qatar is actually our big pocket. There is no endowment at the moment. There is a long-term thought of privatizing some aspects of the museum's operations, and I think the model of the National Gallery is not a bad one in that regard. I've promoted the idea that there should always be some kind of a government contribution to maintaining the institutions they brought into being, while developing private support that would help to augment it for exhibitions and education programs and innovative aspects over the years. It's worked pretty well in Washington, which has got a pretty heavy government thumb. The gallery has thrived even in hard times because the public-private partnership always steps forward. But again, it's very early to tell. We're a government organization. I am a government employee of Qatar, and we go every year to the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Labor to get our budgets approved, and there's always a battle. The museums are free. We now charge for special exhibitions, I suppose as a way of symbolizing that these shows are an augmentation of our program. I'm not sure it's the best idea. I think we're very much still in the audience building mode, and I would, if it were my choice, I would have the museums free at all times. Yes? I think the highlight, if I could boil it down to one simple thing, I think it is an amazing combination in a national personality of a very conservative background and an immensely imaginative and progressive state of mind. Because they are Sunni, many of them are Wahhabi Sunni, and they are very conservative by that nature. On the other hand, they are immensely curious and immensely inventive and immensely pushing forward, but again, within this frame that they want to maintain to protect their cultural background. It's really the most interesting place to learn. Yes, sir. You will say, you will be sensitive to saying the word censorship. I will not. There is a state censor office. And publications that we have put out, I have gone through the office. We've had some interventions, shall we say, and we've also used care in the selection of things we would show. On the other hand, it was very curious to me that in the opening of Mataf, the Contemporary Art Museum, we showed some very early drawings, early, that is to say the 1940s, 50s, drawings by some Arab artists of nudes. And the only thing that The Economist picked up on in the review of the opening of the exhibition was that there were nudes in this exhibition. No one else said anything about it. No Qatari censor came forward and said, take that off the wall. So, you know, I think it's about knowing boundaries and respecting them as the culture continues to grow, develop, diversify, and expand its vision. And I think we do have to be respectful. You know, we may probably someday be confronted by an artist who is going to push the boundaries to the point where we're going to have to make a very strategic decision about that. Or maybe we won't be the ones making the decisions, somebody else will. But yes, there are some very sensitive cultural boundaries. And in terms of the long run, I think those boundaries are better respected now in order to build an audience for the future. Yes? Qatar is very small. You know, Doha is the size of Providence, Rhode Island. I know that because that's where I used to live. And it's very similar. In Providence, there were not too many art galleries. In Doha, there are not too many art galleries now. They're just beginning. We now have 4 major exhibition facilities, and we've spanned them out so that some are in places where people will hang out and go, like Qatar, the new cultural village. There are lots of restaurants. There's a beautiful esplanade along the sea that people can walk at night. We have a really good attendance at this gallery. There are not many contemporary artists at the moment. Our hope is that we will build a coterie of them over time. Virginia Commonwealth University, interestingly enough, has their art school there. They were the first institution that the Emir's wife, Sheikh Hamoza, invited to be part of Education City. I don't think that was by mistake either. You know, it was a kind of big adventure. They offered apparel design, graphic design, and interior design. Now they're offering fine arts, and now they have a graduate program. Soon I hope they will have an industrial design program to attract more male students, because there are not many in that program. But the contemporary art scene is relatively vacant of a lot of artists at the moment. There is a visiting artist program that we're establishing, and we're going to create artist residencies. We're creating a high school for the visual arts and design, the first in the Middle East, which will open in a year and a half. And that should help spawn some younger people who are interested in going to the university to study the arts. But it's a long haul, and it's a very small country. So the number of people who would be interested in being artists is itself already small. There is a growing community of expat artists. My wife, who has a studio in our house, has made friends with a number of Iraqi artists, for example, some of whom live in Doha. But it's very small. And the same could be said for Abu Dhabi. Dubai does have quite a large gallery scene, and so they've attracted quite a number of contemporary artists. But that's a much more commercial hub than Qatar has been. Any other questions? Well, anyway, yeah, all right. Yes, sir. Well, I'm sure you all know that Al Jazeera was created by His Highness the Emir as a mouthpiece for people on the ground, let's say. And they were instrumental, I think, in carrying the torch of these uprisings from country to country. By watching Al Jazeera, people could see what was happening in Tunisia, and therefore it ignited the idea of people in Egypt to follow suit, and so on down the line. The amount of risk and the loss of life of Al Jazeera cameramen and reporters in Libya, for example, is horrendous. But they're there every day, and so we get all this stuff every day in Arabic and English. And so we know and we feel it there. But Qatar is a very quiet place. I have to say the Qataris are very well cared for. They are generally homogenous in their religious background, so they don't have the problems that Bahrain does at the moment. And as far as one knows, the royal family seems to be very happy with his leadership. And having just gotten the World Cup, he's a hero, the Emir. So, okay, thank you very much.